We all need to be able to develop resilience because the world is in a tremendous time of change. And even that aside, our personal lives are always changing. It's just the nature of life. One thing dies away, something else comes up, and you've got to be able to be comfortable with that kind of flow. So resilience has been studied in a number of contexts. People who are sick, who's resilient and who crumbles. People who unfortunately have been prisoners of war or in concentration camps. Kids who have come from really disadvantaged, abusive backgrounds. So even corporations, resilience in corporations is a big area of study. And do you know what? Whether you're an individual or a corporation, the basics of resilience are the same. So let's talk about 5 things that you can do to become a more resilient person. And you know, I wasn't a resilient person myself, so I know these things up close and personal because I've been working on them for years personally. And I can tell you, you will change your brain circuits and you can become resilient no matter what your family history was, no matter what your brain wiring is now. These are skills that can absolutely change your brain, change your attitude, and change your life. The first thing that we know about resilience is that resilient people are realists. And I'll give you a corporate example of that. Remember, there was a first bombing of the World Trade Center years before the planes actually crashed into the towers. At that time, one company, which was Morgan Stanley, said, we better recognize we are in a very high value target, and this is not likely the last attempt. Sooner or later, the terrorists will come again to destroy these towers, and we have to be ready. That's what a realist does. No ducking of the head in the sand, no wishful thinking, just like, hey, we have to pay attention here. And what they did was to get a wonderful, resilient Vietnam vet as their head of security and do drills constantly so that their people, over 7,000 of them, knew how to evacuate from that tower. And then they also got 3 offices off-site, so that were the towers to go down, they'd be able to continue their business. Well, what happened? It was so sad. During the planes crashing into the towers on 9/11, is it paid off for them, even though their floor took a direct hit. Fortunately, they were in the 2nd tower, so that they had some time. But the security got everybody out but 7 people. The head of security actually perished because he was getting everybody else out. But it's extraordinary that they were able to evacuate virtually everybody from those offices. So we all have to be realists. If you're living in a lousy marriage, if you're living with an abusive person, you have to be realistic. It's unlikely that person is going to change. You're going to have to make a radical step toward your own freedom. Or if you've lost your job, it's not a good idea to sit around and do affirmations and expect a job to come to you. You need to get out there and be a realist and take charge. So that's the first part of being resilient. Do something. Actually face things head on, eyes wide open, heart wide open. Ask your friends for help. And that really is important. The second aspect of resiliency is that we're meaning-making animals, human beings are. I often think of the soul as the organ of the creation of meaning. And if you're going through a hard time, you have to be able to create meaning for that so that you don't become depressed. So, for example, many people have had difficult marriages. If you say to yourself, the meaning of this is I'm a no good person, I don't deserve love, you're not very resilient. But if you say to yourself, I have faith and trust that this aspect of my life, like so many others, is a place where I'm learning and I'm growing. Yes, it's a difficult time, but I'm facing it head on, and I will be different now. I've learned so much from this difficult relationship. That's faith and trust. So for some people, it's religious faith, but for many of us, it's simply faith that life is meaningful and good. The third aspect of resilience, we've looked at realism, we've looked at faith and meaning. The third aspect is that resilient people tend to be radically creative. And this is really, really, really important. Radical creativity means that you think outside of the box. And so, for example, instead of saying, well, I've lost my job, this is terrible, the economy's bad, I'm not going to get another one, and then declining into your box, into your rut, and feeling depressed, you start to say to yourself, okay, I can't do perhaps what I've always done before, but what is it that I find most interesting now? What am I most curious about? And then you say to yourself, well, I've always been curious about geology, or I've always been curious about photography. And as much as it may not make sense to you at the moment, you go and you participate in something that you've always been curious about. Maybe you get an internship somewhere, or you volunteer somewhere, and that leads you to a new job. It means you approach things from a different point of view. And as I know, we'll come into a discussion of mindfulness together, but instead of mourning what you don't have, mindfulness means appreciating what you do. And often it's through that deep appreciation that resilience comes up, new ideas and creativity comes up. The last two little hints for resilience, and now we've looked at three. We've looked at being an optimizing realist, optimizing your situation by looking at it head on. We've looked at trust and faith. We've looked at creativity. The last two are social support and a great sense of humor and the absurd. You have to have your friends and your family around you to help you, to cheer you on, to give you ideas. A study of POWs found that in one camp, the POWs had found a way to tap, almost like Morse code, and that allowed them to communicate and talk with each other. That gave them resilience. They shared where they were at. And the last thing is humor. A sense of absurdity is great. So, for example, in the 2008 presidential elections, John McCain was running for office. It doesn't matter what your politics are, because that's not what we're discussing here. We're discussing the fact that he was in a POW camp for 5 years and is clearly a resilient person. After all, he's a senator, quite functional, ran for president, and if you watched Saturday Night Live during that time, not only was Tina Fey great as Sarah Palin, but Senator McCain was great as himself. He has a wonderful sense of humor. And the sense of absurdity lifts you out of your box. It lifts you out of the limits of your own thinking, and it expands your perspective. And that leads to resilience. So remember, even if the genes were not stacked in your direction, even if you came from a pessimistic family, you can change your brain wiring through these simple 5 tips.